So if you look at just the relative, relative situation, you're going to have, it's just naturally going to be a bigger market. I mean, it's naturally. And then, of course, if you do look at some of the rural areas and things like that that haven't been deployed yet, then there's a huge market there as well. And I think they will have much more of a, you talk telehealth and adopting those kinds of things, because they won't be able to deploy the hospital from the rural, the way that the country is laid out, won't necessarily be able to deploy and even want to use the model that we use with hospitals, right? They're going to want to use the more remote type of setting. So there are going to be many opportunities there for us to, for I guess, all kinds of application. And quite frankly, telehealth, I mean, they're embracing Continua quite strongly for one. So I think it's a big opportunity.
I have to talk about costs again. I think there's a clear opportunity. There's potentially a challenge from a competitive perspective, and I think that's one aspect of it. I think the other piece of it is looking at, here are systems who have been constrained by cost for a long time, and they have a large population into which they need to deliver the care, and it's often a rural population and a remote population into which they need to develop care. So how do you look at innovations that are actually occurring at the ground level that are native in those geographies, and take those innovations and reverse engineer them in a way that you can then look at them to work also in the US. So there's a competitive aspect of it, but there's also a very collaborative aspect of it as well that I think it achieves our goals and what we're trying to accomplish.
That's an interesting question you posit, which is that here in this country to get 60 million people in a test would be just exorbitantly expensive. So, and that's kind of the crux of getting a lot of this into the developing world. For example, this kit we're working on with the hospital in India, the blood pressure cuff, the strap, and the others, it's about it's several $100s at least. So there will be patients who can't afford that. So how do we scale it? So one thought is that if the patient can only pay $10 per month for 3 months, then maybe we give them a very inexpensive phone and just a heart rate monitor, because we can learn an awful lot from heart rate. So how do we scale this in the developing world? That's the interesting quandary. How can we start to get less expensive sensors? Right now, some of the FDA-approved blood pressure cuffs are around $100. Well, in the Philippines, we want to help one operator there develop a remote monitoring kit with the same Android phone and create new business models where a nurse will have a blood pressure cuff, a weight, a scale, and a bunch of other tools, and actually go village to village and maybe charge $1 per checkup. Because in the Philippines, the average phone bill is $4 per month. That's all they can afford. So we're working on ways to scale this, but the key is to be able to take these devices and test them less expensively. That's going to be the key for this to evolve in the developing world.
I think the panelists have talked about things from both ends, which are the consumer opportunity with the growing market base that's going to be available, and also from the competitive challenges of dealing with people all around the world who are realizing the same opportunity and want to build devices that compete with yours. And so I think that the key there is to use all of the tools available to you to optimize your time to market. That means both, normally in the companies that we deal with outside of the medical space, that means completing your development as quickly as possible. But in the case of the medical space, it means not only that, but also being able to show that you've done everything that you can to test your device thoroughly and prepare your system so that when you submit it for regulatory approval, that process goes as smoothly as possible.
Yeah, I think also I want to underscore the importance of standards, okay? Because when you do build that device, if you do build it and they're adopting the same standards that you build it once and you sell it many places. And so I think also keeping an eye on the standards and again, don't want to point so much to Continua, but in reality, I think it's a very, very good place to start, because quite frankly, when you get physicians and the medical community, the GEs and the Philips, et cetera, involved in an organization, the Medtronic and others, that means they're behind it, which means that they have lots of people, and as you know, go to, they have on the other side of the coin, they have people that go to hospitals and sell to doctors, so they're very trusted sources. So when you wrap yourself in that situation with those kind of standards, and then start to pursue that, you actually end up finding where you, and interestingly enough, by the way, I think as people are doing development, it's not that difficult to actually use, one might consider even doing a dual purpose where you've got one application that you've got your application, but you look at Continua and say, well, how can I then add that particular function in here So if I do decide to go somewhere else, I've now added it, because one thing when you're doing software development and architecture, if you don't get it in there initially, it's the devil to try to add it, right? It's much better to look at it holistically and say, okay, how would I add that function in? And then do your software development around that, and the validation around that, and with maybe the adjunct, as opposed to designing your process and then say, oh yeah, by the way, 2 years from now we're going to add Continua, for example, and well, by then it's a re-architecture conceivably. So that's something to keep in mind as you're from a competitive perspective.
That's an interesting point, a very good point, because many Chinese companies are developing blood pressure cuffs, they're developing different tools. They can't afford to join Continua yet, but they're at least putting Continua standards in now. So it'll still work in a continuous system, but they don't have the stamp. And that's what we're encouraging people to do. And we will soon have an outreach to universities to let them know about Continua, so they start now. Even though they're not going to get the Continua stamp right away, at least they're building it to Continua guidelines. That's a great point.
So cool, I'll give you the last word on that question.
Thank you. So, I want to say that if we, as a medical device community, want to drive healthcare costs and we want to contribute to that, I think we can use the lessons learned from overseas and places where we can do these trials at really inexpensive cost. And also use that information. I think that's the key there, is how can you use that information, bring it over, and help reduce the cost, not just locally in the U.S., but also globally. I think driving to a $5 blood pressure cuff versus a $100 blood pressure cuff is like a great motivator to have technology innovation drive the healthcare costs. I think that's going to be key. I think similar to many things that are happening in other commercial markets, I think we need to sort of follow that and make sure that we do it safely. I think we have set a bar for safety in this country. Other countries look at it and follow suit from, is it approved by FDA, and they follow FDA's guidance. And it's sometimes that's enough for folks to try. But I think we don't need to stop there. I think we need to learn back from them as well, also in terms of how they start doing, to use the code frugal engineering and frugal innovation. I think that's the key there.
Great, thank you. Well, with that, I'm going to wrap up the questions from here, and I want to invite you now to, if you have any questions of our panelists, to give you a time to pose those. Yes, right here.
Yeah, I was just curious if there are any like mobile data service providers involved with Continua, because if you're looking at keeping costs low and controlling costs, what are the discussions on the cost of data transfer? I mean, it costs $15 a month to continuously get your email updated with an Outlook server, so I'm just curious what the thoughts are on that.
Well, there are operators, if that's what you mean. And yeah, this is a good point. And this was also one of those blocks for many people for a few years. Even with Corventis, when we worked with them several years ago, they were talking to the wrong people. They were talking to the mobile data manager within a big operator who gave them a quote of $60 per month. With many of these devices, it's well under $10. And we are working with the operators to let them know that taking your blood pressure every day, taking your glucose reading every day is not a lot of data. So that's a really good point, and they know, and we're working with them on that to keep it really under $10 for the most part. Unless it's ECG or is there something more of that.